We are joined by our old friend, in my case, Achy Obejas.
I've known her a long time too, Kate.
Okay, well, she and I'll tell you when I first remember knowing Achy, and that was the '83 campaign for Harold Washington.
That's right.
When you were in that press office, I think, with Joanna Brown and some others?
Working with a bunch of guys, yeah. With Laura Washington, the crew.
Yeah, at 30 West. Oh, good memories.
Yeah.
Good memories. But now you are a Californian.
I am. I moved. I didn't intend to, but it sort of worked out that way.
Just happened?
I actually drove Alderman Schiller, who was staying at a friend's house, and then she was moving over to your house for a visit. So I got close to seeing you about a year ago, but not quite. But I had never been on the Mills campus with all those trees and stuff. It was very nice.
Yeah, yeah. I got invited to do a supposedly a very short gig, a 2-year gig in Mills College, and we ended up sort of staying. But it was very seductive, you know. It's this sort of
it's California, for God's
and
sake.
Mills is like the enchanted forest, you know.
Is Mills still an all-women's school?
It's still an all-women's school.
God love them.
Yeah.
Mills. I went to Mundelein, and Mills was one of the last bastions of strong, progressive women's education, and
Connecticut College for Women used to be pretty good like that too.
Yeah.
But they started taking guys in at the time my wife was there.
See, no, it's
an economic thing when they start taking guys in.
Yeah.
What did you say?
It's an economic thing. It always is.
Well, it's odd too, though, because women make up more than 50% of the college students.
Right.
Actually, tell us a bit about yourself, where you were born, and how that has defined your life, and those kind of things. What you're into these days.
Well, I was born in Cuba, and I was born there before Revolution triumphed, but while the revolution was sort of in its, thing. So it was very much a part of my life from the very beginning. You know, I remember, protests and shots and, American planes buzzing and all that stuff. My brother was actually born, and you're not going to believe me because it sounds fictional, but he was born January 1st, 1959, just as the very day of the revolution's
the day of the...
you got a photograph of the guys on horses coming into Havana. I always loved that shot.
Probably different for you.
Yeah. Well, my parents left in '63. We all left in '63. We left by boat. We escaped, as they say. Mm-hmm. And that's, I always say that's been the sort of the defining moment in my life because of the rupture that it caused in my family, and the work that I do, the writing that I do, has a great deal to do with trying to find a way to heal that rupture.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And you've been writing poetry, have you, nonfiction, but have you also, is this book that's coming out fiction, or?
Yeah, it's a collection of short stories.
Okay.
And they're all sort of Cuba related in one way or the other. They're stories I've been writing for the last, 10 or 12 years.
And this is called The Tower of the Antilles.
Tower of the Antilles. It's coming out in June.
In June, okay. Yeah, I love you.
What's your take on the changes that have happened in Cuba with Fidel stepping down and now passing on, Obama coming on the scene and changing some relations? What are you hearing from people you know there, people who study it? What's your sense of what our relationship will be with Cuba under Trump?
Oh, those are all loaded questions, Michael. Thank you.
That's why I asked you.
He likes to ask about 3 or 4 at a time.
You can pick one.
Pick whatever one you want to answer.
Well, the transition actually from Fidel to Raul was very smooth. It was really a genius move. It was done masterfully. They initially said it was a temporary change. Fidel was ill, and Raul was going to come in and just
run things for a while.
Run things for a little bit. Not that Raul hasn't been running things for a really long time. He is the longest serving head of the military of any country in the world, I think, at this point. And so stepping in was not an unnatural place. And that was in 2006, and then in 2008 they made it permanent. Raul's a very different guy than Fidel. He doesn't take up a lot of stage time. He really doesn't talk very much in public, so it's hard to get a specific read from him. The problems that are affecting Cuba now have little to do with who's in power in a weird sort of way, because you know, Cuba has always been sort of dependent on somebody else, on a patron, and it doesn't really matter who.
First the U.S., then the Soviet Union.
Well, actually, I mean,
Spain.
even you know, yeah, I mean, it's in the entire history. It's not just the revolution. It's the entire history of Cuba. Cuba's had, you know, a relationship patronage with a larger, more powerful, more wealthy country that it ultimately depends on. And you know, in 2006, it was very, very dependent on Venezuela, but Venezuela had started to convulse economically and politically, and so I think that the things that began to affect Cuba at that point would have happened no matter what, you know, just because the situation was not within their control. I think the decision to open up diplomatic relations with the U.S. came about in part because Cuba needs another patron now, as Venezuela, again, you know, sort of gets worse and worse and worse.
Right.
And I think the big difference with Raúl and Fidel is in how they handle dissidents. You know, historically, Fidel ignored dissidents. You know, they really, you know, he just did pay them no mind. And then when they got under his skin, he would toss them in jail for incredibly long periods of time.
Mm-hmm.
And Raúl doesn't do that. Part of it is that there's been a technological change, and so the way that people communicate and the way that dissidents get out their message is very different than the way they used to do it before. But Raúl doesn't toss people in jail for long periods of time. He just harasses the hell out of them. You know, there's you know, there are campaigns of harassment towards the dissidents. He'll arrest them for 2 or 3 days, you know, 4 or 5 times in 3 or 4 months over, you know, small things. So he has a policy, I guess, a campaign of sort of wearing people down as opposed to disappearing them. And I don't mean that in the Argentine way. I just mean that from the public view. But the other thing that's very different is that Fidel really didn't have his kids very involved in government. His kids were always very protected and isolated and mysteriously not a part of much of anything. All of Raúl's kids work.
Sort of Trump-like.
Yeah. Well, not really.
Thank you.
Because his kids are
actually
engaged in very real ways in government, and they live in Cuba. I mean, you know, a lot of Fidel's kids live in Cuba. All of Raúl's kids live in Cuba. They shop at the same places that Cubans do, etc. They have a kind of a more on the ground sort of feel about things, and I think that sort of affects the way he does it. I think also because Raúl has such a reputation for being very hardcore, you know, Marxist, it allows him to make changes that it would have been much tougher for Fidel to do. Like a lot of the changes for small businesses and a lot of the sort of the small capitalism that's happening in Cuba. It's sort of like, you know, Nixon opening to China thing, you know, because Nixon was such a conservative guy, nobody thought he'd sold out when he opened to China.
Right, right.
I think because Raúl is this really hardcore guy, according to, you know, legend, then you can do some of the things you're doing. You know, what's going to happen under Trump, it's not really up to Raúl, it's really up to Trump, and it's hard to say what Trump is going to do. I mean, what he seems to have promised to South Florida is that he's going to undo what Obama has started, which I thought was the thing to do. I thought was the correct thing to do. But then again, I think Trump is so completely unethical that he could probably be bought out with a hotel.
Just a quick note on that. Is there a split in the community in Florida around how to deal with it? Is there an age split?
Oh, there's a huge split, and you know, it's not just an age split. It's also a split about when you came. Right. You know, if you came, you know, like pre-2000, and you're a little older, you have a very strong chance of being, you know, very pro-embargo, blah blah blah. If you came post-2000, no matter how old you are, chances are that you're very pro-diplomatic relations opening and stuff like that. But there is a huge generational split, massive generational split, because of course, those of us who grew up in the United States, you know, think somewhat like Americans and believe that, you know, diplomacy is the way to go, and that coup d'etats are uncool, and that you don't do regime change.
So, Achy, given that Cuba is a setting for a lot of your writing,
yes,
does this change and Fidel's passing not mark on a whole new chapter for you in terms of covering or having your background of your writing change?
That's a really good question. You know, he just dropped, so it's hard to say exactly what that change is going to be. I found his death kind of anticlimactic in a weird way, in part because he'd left the public scene, you know, years before.
Right.
He hadn't been a force in Cuba in a long time. He felt like a shadow so much.
I think a lot of us felt that way, actually.
Yeah.
Interestingly.
Yeah, and there was a weird sadness to it, you know, and I think for a lot of people, they found themselves, regardless of their political position, a lot of Cubans found themselves sort of thrown back because this had been the backdrop of their lives. Fidel had been the backdrop of their lives.
And, you know, the U.S. doesn't cover the reality that, you know, as far as here we are in the U.S. with crummy health care, terrible health care. And in the island of Cuba, thanks to Fidel and his connection with Mao and the barefoot doctors syndrome, etc., they have doctors so many doctors, they've sent them internationally to help when help is needed. And I just really want to hold that up so high for people in the U.S. to see that our entire system based on this money thing is so wrong. People need to be able to take care of themselves.
Right. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens now in January with the new president and how they go about repealing Obamacare and all the things that they intend to do vis-a-vis Medicare, Social Security. It's a real dismantling of the safety net. It's mind-boggling.
It's scary as heck. I mean, here in Illinois, we are dismantling the safety net day by day, thanks to Ronner. He doesn't care. It is truly at the age of, I got mine, to heck with you. Do you ever miss the Midwest?
I do. I do miss the
think.
Oh,
Midwest.
I'm glad to hear that. When are you coming home?
She's here now.
Oh, my wife would probably, you know, come home tomorrow if we, you know, to stay if she could. She's very much a Midwesterner and would very much like to return to the Midwest. You know, it's really an economic issue for us.
You've got a job.
Yeah, which is perverse to think because California is so much more expensive and really so prohibitive in so many ways. But because of this position that I have at Mills and the fact that I, you know, was just freelancing here in Chicago, and I was doing fine, but it's when you have a kid, which is really what happened to us. You know, we have a 5-year-old.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, you know, it just changes the whole, you know, scenario. You know,
Of course.
I could absolutely as an adult by myself go 3 months without a drop of income and be fine with it.
I think I've done that recently.
Right, but when you have a kid, you start thinking, oh my God, I can't do this. What if something happens or whatever? So I felt compelled to find something steadier.
So when The Tower of the Antilles comes out in June, your next book, will you be doing a whirlwind book tour and come back to Chicago, I'm sure?
I'm sure I'll be reading on Women and Children. I'm sure there'll be some other reading, but I would put money on Women and Children. We have such a long relationship, you know.
Women and Children First, great bookstore up on Clark Street in Andersonville.
Yeah, I mean, I think every book I've ever written, I've launched at Women and Children First. So.
It's a great place to launch from. And
yeah,
we're so happy that, like the Heartland, it's still there with the founders moving on.
But do you have plans for the next book?
I do, actually.
Let's hear about it. Scoop it up for us here.
Oh, funny you should say that. I'm working on a novel, and it's really a dystopian piece about.
What piece?
A dystopian.
Dystopian.
I'm going to look that one up.
She can define it for you.
Not utopia.
Yeah. There you go.
About a small, unnamed island, which is funny you were talking about the healthcare because the story is really about working very hard towards things that you really believe in and sacrifices that you have to make in order to do this, and how sometimes you sort of go astray in that process. And it's all told from the point of view of an observer who comes to hang out with a doctor on this island, who is part of this medical system that actually works very well. But when things sort of fall apart, in order to keep this thing going, things sort of, you know, create variety of moral dilemmas for her that she has to face. It's actually based on a little something that happened to me when I went to Hibata, my dad's hometown on the eastern side of the island. We were only there for a few days because we were just sort of traveling through Santiago, and we heard from the locals. The town was lovely. Everything was beautifully painted. You know, the economy seemed to be existing on a completely different plane from the rest of the island, and they didn't have tourism because it's a tiny, tiny,
Right.
tiny little village with nothing. You know, and I was very curious about what was going on here, that they were able to survive so well. And a number of the fishermen told us that the town had an underground economy because when the DEA chased drug pirates,
They grow reefer.
the coke that
Oh.
when the pirates dropped
Wash
the
it
coke,
off on the beach.
it washes off on the beach.
Oh my gosh.
And
I've heard great stories about people running to the beach in Florida when the bales were floating in.
yeah, so the currents of the Great Blue River, as Hemingway used to call it,
The Great Blue River. Right.
and ended up bringing this coke to the town, and apparently they made decisions about how to economically exploit this. And we were like, he's either telling us
That's some stepped on coke, baby.
yeah, I mean, I just thought he's either telling us an incredible, fabulous fib, or what an amazing story. So it was a very fortuitous thing to run into him because it inspired me either way.
So, Achy Obejas, author, novelist, poet. You were a newspaper gal for a while when you were in Chicago. Do you miss that?
That I do not miss.
That a girl.